Close your eyes and stand on the dusty ridge of the Ophel, just south of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The year is 445 BC. The air doesn't smell of incense yet. It smells of wet lime, freshly quarried stone, and the sweat of men working in frantic silence. You hear the rhythmic clink-clink of iron chisels. Around you, the walls of Jerusalem are a jagged ruin, a scar left by the Babylonians decades earlier. But today there is a new sound, the gallop of a horse. A rider arrives bearing a leather scroll sealed with the signet of the Achaemenid king, Artaxerxes I. The man carrying it is Nehemiah, a high-ranking official from the Persian court at Susa. He isn't a conqueror, he is a rebuilder. In this moment, the Levant isn't a battlefield between Persia and the Jews. It is the western anchor of an Iranian peace. And the conflict hasn't begun yet. For now, Persia is the protector. But the geopolitical architecture being laid down in these stone walls will, centuries later, become the very fault line that shakes the modern world. To understand the first Iran-Israel conflict, we must first understand the first Iran-Israel alliance. In 539 BC, Cyrus the Great did what no previous Mesopotamian conqueror had done. He practiced religious pluralism as a tool of statecraft. By allowing the Jewish exiles to return from Babylon to Jerusalem, Cyrus wasn't just being the great, he was being a master strategist. The Levant was the buffer zone. To the west lay the Greeks, to the south, the wealthy and rebellious Egyptians. By sponsoring a pro-Persian client state in Judea, the Iranian heartland secured its flank. For 200 years, the land of Israel was the satrapy of Yehud. It was a time of Pax Persica. However, the stakes were clear. The Levant would be stable only as long as Persia was the undisputed hegemon. The moment a rival power, be it Greece or Rome, reached for the Mediterranean coast, the Levant would be transformed from a Persian garden into a Persian graveyard. What was life like for a farmer in the Galilee or a merchant in Gaza under Persian rule? Housing and food. Most Judeans lived in modest four-room stone houses. Their lives were dictated by the agricultural cycle, wheat, wine, and oil. But under Persian rule, the global economy arrived. You might find an Attic Greek coin in a Jerusalem market, or a Persian-style bronze cosmetic burner in a coastal home. The imperial tax, the commoner felt the hand of Susa through the manda, tax. A portion of every harvest was diverted to the local Persian governor. If you couldn't pay in grain, you paid in labor, maintaining the royal road that stretched all the way to the Iranian Plateau. The religious bureaucracy. Interestingly, the Persian king was the ultimate vicar of local law. If the high priest in Jerusalem wanted to enforce a decree, he needed the backing of the Persian satrap. The first Iran-Israel relationship was one of administrative integration. The Hebrew Bible even refers to Cyrus as Messiah, the only non-Jew to hold the title. The loop of history began to turn when the Persian Empire's grip on the Mediterranean faltered. The problem? The rise of the West, Alexander the Great, and later Rome. The change. Persia, now under the Parthian and later Sassanid dynasties, and viewed the Roman occupation of Jerusalem as an intolerable threat to their western border. The consequence? The Levant became the Vietnam of antiquity. In 40 BC, the first Iran-Israel conflict, in a military sense, truly ignited. The Parthian Persians invaded the Roman-held Levant. They didn't come to destroy the local population, they came to install a pro-Persian king, Antigonus, against the Roman-backed Herod the Great. For a brief, violent window, Jerusalem became the front line of an Iranian-Roman proxy war. This established the modern template. Persia uses local Levantine factions to undermine Western influence. The West uses the Levant as a fortress to keep Persia contained within the Iranian Plateau. The similarities are haunting. In 40 BC, the Parthian Persians provided the military muscle to local Judean factions who wanted to expel the Roman imperialists. In 2026, we see a mirror image. An Iranian state supporting local axis of resistance groups to expel Western influence from the same Mediterranean shores. The geography hasn't changed. The Jordan Rift Valley is still the primary defensive line. The port of Jaffa, or modern Haifa, is still the strategic prize. The conflict isn't about ancient hatreds. It is about the fact that any power sitting in Tehran eventually realizes that to be safe, it must have a say in what happens on the shores of the Mediterranean. The first Iran-Israel conflict reached its most violent pre-modern peak in the early 7th century. By this time, the Achaemenid peace was a 1,000-year-old memory. The Sassanid Empire, the second great Iranian superpower, was locked in a world war of antiquity with the Byzantine, Eastern Roman Empire. In 614 AD, the Sassanid king Khosrow II launched a campaign that would change the Levant forever. His general, Sharbaraz, marched on Jerusalem. This wasn't just a border skirmish. It was a total collapse of the Roman frontier. To the local Jewish population, who had suffered centuries of Byzantine religious persecution, the Persians weren't seen as invaders. They were initially welcomed as liberators. The fall of the city. Archaeological layers from this period show a city under extreme duress. The Sassanid military, experts in siegecraft, used heavy ballistae and wooden towers to breach the Byzantine walls. When the city fell, the impact was felt from London to Constantinople. And the true cross, the most holiest relic of Christendom, was seized by the Persians and carried back to their capital, Ctesiphon, near modern Baghdad. For the 15 years that Jerusalem and the Levant were under Sassanid Persian rule, 614 to 629 AD, the commoner experienced a world turned upside down. Housing and urban shift. The Byzantine Cardo, the main merchant street of Jerusalem, saw its shops shuttered or repurposed for Persian military logistics. The Greek-speaking elite fled to Egypt or Cyprus, replaced by Persian administrators who spoke Middle Persian, Pahlavi. The economy of war. The Levant was stripped of its liquid wealth to fund the Sassanid war machine. Gold and silver coins minted in Iran began to circulate in the Galilee, and while the agricultural output of the coastal plains was diverted to feed the massive Persian garrisons stationed at Caesarea and Gaza. Religious realignment. For a brief window, the Persians handed the administration of Jerusalem back to local Jewish leaders. This created a profound geopolitical pivot. For the first time since the Roman conquest, a power from the Iranian Plateau had explicitly aligned itself with the local indigenous population against a Western Byzantine occupier. The loop of history eventually ground both empires to dust. The problem: the Sassanid-Byzantine wars were so expensive and prolonged that they emptied the treasuries of both Iran and the Levant. The change. By 628 AD, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius launched a desperate counteroffensive, pushing the Persians back to Iraq. The consequence? Both superpowers were so physically and economically depleted that they were unable to resist a new force emerging from the Arabian desert, the Islamic Caliphate. The first Iran-Israel conflict of the 7th century proves a critical historical law. When Persia and the Levant are locked in total war, a third party almost always emerges to seize the ruins. In the 630s, that third party was the Arabs. By the 1100s, it would be the Crusaders. Fast forward to the 12th century. The Levant is now a patchwork of Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli. While we often think of the Crusades as Europe versus Islam, the Iranian intellectual and military DNA was quietly running the show behind the scenes. Saladin, Salah ad-Din, the man who eventually recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders, was a Kurd born in Tikrit, but his entire administrative and military education was Persianate. His chief advisors, his tax systems, and his Ikta land grant system were all evolutions of Sassanid and Seljuk Persian models. When Saladin's armies met the Crusader king, Baldwin IV, at the Battle of Montgisard, they weren't just fighting with swords, they were fighting with Persian tactics, horse archers, feigned retreats, and the high-mobility warfare perfected on the Iranian Plateau. The Levant remained the Shatter Zone, where Western European knights met Eastern Persian-influenced military science. If you look at the map of the Levant in 1187 AD and compare it to the map of the region in 2026 AD, the logic remains eerily consistent. The coast, controlled by Western-oriented powers, Crusaders then, Mediterranean-facing Israel now. On the interior, controlled by Eastern-oriented powers, the Ayyubids, Seljuks then, the Iranian axis of resistance, now. History shows us that the Levant is never settled. It is a dynamic equilibrium. When the East, Persia, is strong, it pushes to the sea. When the West is strong, it pushes into the desert. The first Iran-Israel conflict isn't a single war. It is the 2,500-year story of this moving boundary. As we enter the 13th century, the first Iran-Israel conflict takes its most surreal turn. The Mongols, having obliterated the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, transformed the Iranian Plateau into the Ilkhanate, a Mongol-Persian successor state. For the first time, a power based in Tabriz, northwest Iran, looked at the Levant not as a religious prize, but as a logistical necessity to crush the Egyptian Mamluks. On the Battle of Ain Jalut, in 1260 AD, a Mongol-Persian force marched into the Galilee. This army was a fascinating synthesis. Mongol cavalry led by a Nestorian Christian general named Kitbuka, supported by Persian engineers and administrators. They faced the Mamluks of Egypt in the valley of Jezreel, the same ground where modern armored divisions have maneuvered. The conflict here was a clash of two different Eastern systems: the Persianate-Mongol model of a centralized bureaucratic empire versus the Mamluk model of a military caste. The Mongols' defeat at Ain Jalut marked the first time the Persian-based expansion was permanently halted in the southern Levant. It set the modern border. The Euphrates River became the Iron Curtain between the Persian-influenced East and the Mediterranean West for centuries. By 1501, the rise of the Safavid dynasty in Iran fundamentally changed the DNA of the Iran-Levant relationship. Before the Safavids, the conflict was largely about territory and trade. After the Safavids, it became ideological and sectarian. When Shah Ismail I declared Shia Islam the state religion of Iran, it sent shockwaves through the Levant. The cities of Damascus, Jerusalem, and Aleppo were under the control of the Sunni Ottoman Turks. The conflict was no longer just about who sat in the palace of the satrap, it was about the soul of the region. Daily life under the Safavid shadow, trade, and pilgrimage. If you were a merchant in 16th century Gaza, your world was defined by the rivalry between the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul and the Safavid Shah in Isfahan. Trade routes were frequently cut. However, like a Persian quarter, remained in many Levantine cities. Pockets of scholars and silk merchants who kept the cultural bridge alive even when the borders were closed. The military buffer, the southern Levant, modern Israel, Palestine, became the deep hinterland for the Ottomans. They fortified the walls of Jerusalem. The walls we see today were built by Suleiman the Magnificent, partly as a statement of Sunni hegemony against the rising Persian threat to the east. We have reached the end of our chronological journey, but the loop remains in motion. The problem: the Levant, modern Israel, Lebanon, Syria, remains the only land bridge connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. It is too small to be a superpower, but too strategically placed to be left alone. Chart the change. Every strong Iranian state, from Cyrus to the Sassanids to the Safavids to the modern Islamic Republic, inevitably seeks a corridor to the sea. This is not a choice. It is a geographic imperative for a state that wants to be a global player. The consequence? This westward push always creates a friction point with the maritime powers of the West, the Greeks, Romans, Crusaders, and modern Western-aligned states. When we look at the headlines of 2026, we aren't seeing a new conflict. We are seeing the latest chapter of a 2,500-year-old volume. The Achaemenids taught us that the Levant thrives under a unified supersystem, but loses its independence. The Sassanids taught us that a total war between the East and the West over the Levant usually destroys both sides and invites a third, unexpected player to the table. The Safavids taught us that when you add religion to geography, the conflict becomes eternal. Today, the first Iran-Israel conflict has evolved into a high-tech shadow war, but the stakes are identical to those of 445 BC. Who controls the ports? Who taxes the trade? And who gets to define the law of the land bridge? History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes in the dusty hills of the Levant. As long as the Iranian Plateau remains a fortress and the Mediterranean remains a gateway, these two regions will remain locked in a dance that began with a Persian king and a stone wall in Jerusalem, 2.5 millennia ago.